There is something happening within your mind that is so consistent, so familiar, that it often goes completely unnoticed. You think. Thoughts appear. They move through your awareness. And without realizing it, you begin to follow them. You begin to agree with them, not by saying it out loud, not by making a clear decision, but by allowing them to continue without question. This is the silent agreement, an ongoing acceptance of what appears in your mind, an agreement that forms without awareness. And because it forms without awareness, it feels natural, it feels automatic. It feels as though it is simply the way things are. But the moment you begin to look more closely, something becomes clear. Not every thought you have is true. Not every thought you have is useful. Not every thought you have reflects what is actually possible. And yet, when those thoughts are repeated, they begin to feel real. They begin to feel accurate. They begin to feel like something you should follow. This is how the agreement begins. A thought appears. It is not questioned. It is not examined. It is simply accepted. And once it is accepted, it begins to influence how you feel, how you respond, how you act. This happens continuously, thought after thought, day after day. And over time, these accepted thoughts begin to form patterns, patterns of belief, patterns of expectation, patterns of behavior, until eventually they begin to shape your experience. You begin to act in ways that align with what you have accepted. You begin to move in directions that reflect what you have agreed with, and all of this happens quietly, without clear awareness, without conscious intention, which is why it feels so natural. But once you begin to see it, something changes. You begin to recognize that the thoughts you follow are not random. They are selected, not by force, but by agreement. And once you recognize that you are agreeing, you begin to realize that you can choose differently, that you do not have to accept every thought that appears, that you do not have to follow every direction it suggests. And in that realization, something shifts. Because the moment you stop agreeing automatically, you begin to take control of what shapes you. As you begin to observe this more carefully, something becomes clear. The agreement you make with your thoughts is not something you notice in a single moment. It forms over time, through repetition, through familiarity, through the absence of questioning. A thought appears once, and it may pass. But when that same thought appears again, and again, and again, and each time it is accepted without resistance, it begins to take on a different role. It begins to feel consistent, and what feels consistent begins to feel true. This is how a simple thought becomes a belief, not because it has been proven, but because it has been repeated. And once it becomes a belief, it begins to influence everything. It shapes how you interpret situations. It affects how you respond to challenges. It determines how far you are willing to go. Because you are no longer dealing with a passing thought. You are operating from something that feels established, something that feels certain. But the certainty is not coming from truth. It is coming from familiarity. This is where many people become limited without realizing it. They are not held back by reality. They are held back by what they have accepted as reality, by the thoughts they have agreed with over time. And because those thoughts feel familiar, they are rarely questioned. They are treated as facts, as boundaries, as definitions of what is possible. But once you begin to see this process, something changes. You begin to recognize that belief is not fixed. It is formed, and if it is formed, it can also be changed. But that change does not begin with force. It begins with awareness, with the willingness to notice what you have been agreeing with, and to question whether it deserves that agreement. There is a process happening within your mind that is so constant, so familiar, that it often goes completely unnoticed. Thoughts appear, one after another, forming a continuous stream of interpretation, judgment, memory, and anticipation. Most people believe they are simply observing these thoughts, that they are passive to them, that thinking is something that just happens. But what is rarely recognized is that there is another step taking place beneath the surface. Agreement. Each thought that enters your awareness is not just seen, it is either accepted or questioned. And in most cases, it is accepted automatically. Not because you consciously decide to agree with it, but because you do not interrupt it, you do not examine it, you allow it to continue without resistance. This is the silent agreement, An unconscious acceptance of the thoughts that pass through your mind, and because it happens without awareness, it feels natural. It feels like truth. It feels like reality itself. But not every thought that appears is accurate. Not every thought reflects what is possible. Not every thought deserves to be followed. Yet when a thought is repeated and consistently accepted, it begins to take on weight. A single thought may pass without influence, but a repeated thought, followed without question, begins to shape perception. It begins to define how you interpret situations. It begins to influence how you respond, and over time it begins to form belief. This is how something subtle becomes powerful, not through force, but through repetition and acceptance. A thought appears. This will not work. It is not questioned. It appears again. It is followed again. Over time, it begins to feel certain, not because it has been proven, but because it has been agreed with repeatedly. And once it becomes a belief, it begins to guide behavior. Action is reduced, risk is avoided, opportunities are dismissed before they are even explored, and the individual begins to live within the boundaries of that belief, not because those boundaries are real, but because they have been accepted as real. This is how the mind shapes experience, quietly, consistently, without drawing attention to itself. The agreement is not loud. It does not announce itself. It happens in silence, in the space between thought and response, in the moment where a thought is allowed to pass without being challenged. And once you begin to see this, something changes. You begin to recognize that thinking is not the same as truth, that repetition is not the same as accuracy, that familiarity is not the same as reality, and in that recognition, something begins to open. Because if thoughts are being agreed with, then they can also be questioned. If beliefs are being formed, then they can also be reshaped. If patterns are being reinforced, then they can also be interrupted. But that process does not begin with force. It begins with awareness, with the simple recognition that you have been agreeing without realizing it. And once that awareness is present, the automatic process begins to slow. You begin to notice thoughts as they appear. You begin to observe them instead of immediately following them. You begin to see that not every thought requires agreement, and in that moment, something shifts. Because the mind is no longer operating without direction. It is being observed, and what is observed can be changed. This is where control begins, not by stopping thought, but by choosing what you agree with, and what you choose to agree with will ultimately shape everything that follows. As this awareness begins to deepen, something important becomes clear. The agreement you make with your thoughts is not something that happens in a single moment. It is something that is built over time, through repetition, through familiarity, through the absence of interruption. A thought may appear once and pass without much influence, but when that same thought appears repeatedly and is accepted each time without question, it begins to take on a different role. It begins to feel consistent. And what feels consistent begins to feel reliable. And what feels reliable begins to feel true. This is how belief is formed, not through proof, but through repeated agreement. A thought such as, "This is too difficult," may appear once and be dismissed. But if it appears again and is accepted again, and then appears again and is followed again, it begins to establish itself. It becomes familiar. It becomes expected. And eventually, it becomes something you no longer question. This is where the shift happens. You are no longer dealing with a passing thought. You are operating from a belief, and belief changes everything. Because belief does not simply exist in the mind. It influences perception. It shapes interpretation. It guides action. A person who believes something is difficult will approach it differently than someone who does not. They may hesitate. They may prepare for struggle. They may avoid it altogether. And in doing so, they reinforce the belief. The experience becomes aligned with the expectation, and the expectation is strengthened. This is how patterns are created, not by force, but by repetition. A thought is agreed with. That agreement becomes belief. That belief shapes behavior, and that behavior produces results that confirm the belief. This cycle continues, quietly, consistently, until it feels permanent, until it feels like reality itself. But what is actually happening is reinforcement, a loop that is being maintained through repeated agreement. And because it is not questioned, it continues. This is where many people become limited without realizing it. They are not restricted by external conditions. They are guided by internal agreements, by the thoughts they have accepted as true. And because those thoughts feel familiar, they are rarely challenged. They are treated as facts, as boundaries, as definitions of what is possible. But once you begin to see this process clearly, something changes. You begin to recognize that belief is not fixed. It is formed. And if it is formed, it can also be changed. But change does not begin with force. It does not begin with trying to replace thoughts. It begins with awareness, with the willingness to observe what you have been agreeing with, to notice the thoughts that repeat, to recognize the ones that have been accepted without question, and to begin asking a simple question. Does this thought deserve my agreement? Because the moment you begin to ask that question, the automatic process begins to break. You are no longer accepting everything that appears. You are examining it. You are evaluating it. You are deciding whether it aligns with where you want to go. And in that decision, you begin to take control, not of the thoughts themselves, but of the agreement you make with them. And that agreement is what shapes everything that follows. As this process becomes clearer, something begins to stand out in a way that is difficult to ignore. The thoughts you agree with do not just influence what you do. They influence who you believe yourself to be. Over time, repeated agreement creates identity. Not in a single moment, but gradually. A thought is accepted, then repeated, then reinforced, and eventually it becomes part of how you see yourself. A person who repeatedly agrees with thoughts of doubt begins to identify with hesitation. They begin to expect uncertainty. They begin to define themselves as someone who struggles to move forward, not because that is their true nature, but because it has been reinforced through repeated agreement. This is how identity forms. Quietly, without announcement, through patterns that are rarely questioned. And once identity is formed, it begins to guide behavior. A person does not simply act based on what is possible. They act based on who they believe they are. And if that belief is shaped by limiting thoughts, those limits begin to appear everywhere, in decisions, in opportunities, in how far they are willing to go. This is why the silent agreement is so powerful, because it does not just affect isolated moments, it builds a framework, a structure through which everything is interpreted. And within that structure, certain actions feel natural, and others feel out of place. A person may want to move forward. They may want to change. But if the identity they have formed does not support that movement, resistance appears. Not because change is impossible, but because it does not align with the current pattern. This is where awareness becomes critical, because once you begin to see that identity is shaped by agreement, you begin to question it. You begin to ask whether the version of yourself you are holding on to is accurate or simply repeated, whether it reflects your potential or just your past. And in asking those questions, something begins to loosen. The identity no longer feels fixed. It begins to feel flexible, changeable, something that can evolve. And as that shift begins, your actions begin to change, not because you are forcing yourself, but because you are no longer confined to the same definition. You begin to act in ways that feel new, to explore possibilities that once felt out of reach, to move beyond patterns that once felt permanent. And with each of those actions, the old identity weakens, and a new one begins to form. One not built on automatic agreement, but on conscious choice, on awareness, on direction. And that is where transformation truly begins. If you bring all of this together, one realization becomes clear. The thoughts that shape your life are not the ones that appear. They are the ones you agree with, because every thought is a suggestion, a possibility, a direction. But it is your agreement that gives it power. It is your acceptance that allows it to influence you. And once you begin to see this, everything begins to change. You are no longer at the mercy of what appears in your mind. You are no longer automatically guided by every thought that passes through your awareness. You begin to recognize that you have a role in the process, that you are not just observing, you are participating, and that participation is what shapes your direction. Each time you agree with a thought, you reinforce it. Each time you question it, you interrupt it. Each time you choose not to follow it, you weaken its influence. This is where control begins, not through force, not through suppression, but through awareness, through the ability to notice what is happening and respond differently. And as this awareness becomes consistent, something begins to shift. The automatic agreement starts to fade. The patterns begin to loosen. The thoughts that once felt convincing begin to feel optional. And in that space, something new begins to emerge. Choice. The ability to decide which thoughts deserve your attention, which thoughts deserve your belief, which thoughts deserve to shape your actions. And that choice changes everything. Because once you stop agreeing with every thought, you begin to take control of your mind. And when you take control of your mind, you begin to take control of your life, not all at once, but steadily, through repeated awareness, through intentional agreement, through the decision to follow thoughts that lead forward and leave behind the ones that do not. And that is the shift. From being shaped by thought to shaping your direction through awareness. And once that shift begins, everything begins to change. There is one final layer to this that becomes clear the more you observe it. The agreement you make with your thoughts does not only shape your present, it shapes your future. Because the thoughts you repeatedly accept begin to influence what you expect, and what you expect begins to influence what you notice, what you pursue, what you avoid. A person who agrees with limitation begins to expect limitation. They begin to see it more often. They begin to anticipate it. And because of that, they begin to move in ways that align with it, not intentionally, but consistently. And over time, this creates a pattern that feels predictable, that feels familiar, that feels like reality. But it is not reality itself. It is the result of repeated agreement. On the other hand, a person who begins to question their thoughts starts to experience something different. They begin to interrupt that pattern. They begin to notice possibilities that were previously ignored. They begin to act in ways that do not align with limitation. And in doing so, they begin to create different outcomes. This is where direction begins to change, not through force, but through awareness. Through the decision to no longer accept every thought as truth, to no longer follow every suggestion that appears, to no longer agree automatically. And as that process continues, something powerful begins to take place. The mind becomes less reactive and more directed. The thoughts that once felt dominant begin to lose their authority. The patterns that once felt fixed begin to loosen. And in their place, something new begins to form. Clarity, choice, direction. And with that, a new experience begins to unfold, one that is no longer defined by what has been repeated, but by what is consciously chosen. And that is where real change begins, not when thoughts disappear, but when agreement becomes intentional. Because once you choose what you agree with, you begin to shape everything that follows.